Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe. The Pan-African Parliament won't be sitting in Midrand on Wednesday. This as the country will have a national shutdown. Cosatu and Saftu members are expected to take to the streets to voice their dissatisfaction with the high cost of living and demand that government intervene. The continental body's MPs have been meeting to discuss a number of challenges facing member states. The Pan-African Parliament President, Chief Fortune Charumbira, says that the doors will be closed on Wednesday. Well, joining us now is SABC Senior reporter Khayelihle Khumalo to look at the possible impact of this national strike by Saftu, South African trade unions. Thanks so much for joining us, Khayelihle. So, no work at the PAP tomorrow?
Well, so far, from what you understand so far, Peter, subsequently there has been a meeting where they were looking at the possibility of not having quite a very heavy schedule, where they'll be moving tomorrow's program to Friday so that they try and just allow at least, the committees to meet. But of course, from what they are saying, it's going to be a very limited number of people present inside the parliamentary precinct. But also, they say this is part of a precautionary measure that they have in place. They've been given a security advice. In fact, you did speak to President Charumbira, so that was a very clear statement that he gave us.
All right. So what are they discussing at the moment? What's on the agenda?
So it's a plethora of issues, Peter. You look at, for example, something that we've not had before in their lexicon. They talk about reinvigorating, repositioning this institution that has been mired in controversies. You forget those scenes, the chaotic scenes where they couldn't reach the consensus because of the differences from so many regions over the policy of rotation. So they say now they want to put all of that behind. So now they want to go back to the real founding principles of this parliamentary institution for the continent, especially at such a very critical time where they are meeting. The issue of food security, quite a fundamental issue that they are talking about. The issue of peace and security in the continent, but also something that we've not had from the Pan-African Parliament. Them giving the countries who are going to the elections the advice, talking to the political actors to respect the outcomes, talking to the electorate to understand the importance of democracy and why, they should just go out there and elect new leaders. And it was quite interesting because when we spoke to President Charumbira, in a nutshell, without really directly saying anything towards the Kenyan defeated presidential candidate, Raila Odinga, but he said something to the effect that these post-election conflicts, they are bound to create tension and instability. But of course, he didn't say the name.
Yeah, look, we could have another whole conversation on that. But let's start with the reimagining the Pan-African Parliament and trying to unify it. Did the chief say how he's going to do it?
Well, Peter, the chief does admit that it's quite a very colossal responsibility. He does talk about the differences that are still visible in the House. So from time to time, he does implore the MPs to understand why they are there. And all of this just comes, with his election just a couple of months ago, where you had Musa Faki coming from Addis Ababa to chastising the MPs to understand that they're just not there to collect the SNT and all the pacts that they are subjected to, but they really have a very important mandate of making sure that economic integration becomes the reality. The voices of the Africans are well represented in this institution. The issue of the ratification of Malabo Protocol to give this legislative assembly the teeth that are necessary to hold so many AU organs responsible in terms of so many aspects. So he does concede it's going to be quite a big task. So he calls for this consensus amongst the MPs, just so that they rally behind this new thing.
That is one question I wanted to ask you, is the authority that the Pan-African Parliament has. At this stage, they've been begging for some kind of power, and I just wonder, are they closer to that ideal, or do they continue to be more a body that convenes talks, discusses and makes recommendations?
So it's been a very long-standing debate, Peter. I mean, you go back to, the couple of period ago, from the very establishment of this institution, whether is it going to be a consultative body, is it going to be given teeth? So far in terms of the ratification, there has been a bit of hesitancy from the side of the member states. So it's one of the issues that Chief Charumbira has been emphasizing, calling on countries to make sure that they ratify these protocols, saying it's in the interest of the institution. But obviously when you speak to analysts, they also do speak about the visibility of this institution. For example, talking about the issue of making sure that when the AU heads of state are meeting in Addis Ababa, perhaps the PAP leadership be given a platform to address the heads of state, as opposed to being in the background. But also something that was quite unprecedented during this session, Peter, was the involvement of so many institutions that were created to enable development, your NAPID, your African peer review mechanism. So they've been very much in the thick of things in terms of their involvement, preaching that gospel of making sure that good governance, the rule of law, and many other important pillars as well.
You mentioned the elections that were not mentioned by name. Angola is going to elections tomorrow, and they say this is going to be a tight race. The MPLA has been accused of using state resources to make it a little bit harder for UNITA to cross the line. So where does the Pan-African Parliament sit, where there are all these questions that are always raised about the freeness and fairness of certain elections across the continent, and one doesn't really ever get to see it speak powerfully against some failures?
Well, that's right. I mean, it's part of the, just as they talk about this resurrection. So it's going to be part and parcel. But currently they do have the observers who are on the ground. One of the vice presidents from Cabo Verde is right in Luanda, making sure that they observe. But it's always a massive challenge in terms of, the quality of the elections, especially like you just say, Peter, Angola, the position where it finds itself, where you do have the incumbent president, Lorenzo, saying now, well, you have to vote for MPLA in honor of the legacy of the late Jose Eduardo dos Santos. So, you have all these sort of...
But I mean, in that Pan-African Parliament are representatives of those governments across the continent. This is an opportunity for them to call them to account, but one rarely ever sees that. I think the only time they fight is when positions are up for grabs. And I just wonder, we had an election overturned in Malawi. Where was the Pan-African Parliament before the courts stepped in?
I think one of the biggest challenges facing, of course, the legislators there, Peter, will be the very issue of the dissolution of the parliaments. For example, there were no representatives from Angola and Lesotho as well. We know that they'll be going to the elections as well in October. So I think that's a big challenge. But I suppose what should be a very main message driven by the Pan-African Parliament without those MPs. So if they talk about accountability, if they talk about, the free and fair elections and the fairness in terms of representation and, just the conducive environment prior to the elections being held, the opposition parties given also sufficient amount of airtime. I think it is a very important question as they talk about crafting this new, monitoring and evaluation framework that is going to guide them. I suppose it's going to be a very main issue that's going to feature if they're really prepared to regain or try to re-establish a prestige.
Khayelihle, we'll leave it there for the time being, but we'll chat again at the end of this session and just see perhaps what's happened, what's moved, what's changed. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
It's a pleasure.
All right, that's one of our senior reporters there, particularly on the international beat, speaking to us about the Pan-African Parliament, which is sitting in Midrand here in South Africa, just north of Johannesburg. They're taking the day off tomorrow, though, on security advice because of the national shutdown.